I can't see the notification.
Yes, we're streaming.
Splendid, splendid. All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday. It is the beginning of February in 2025. It's the first Sunday of February. We're here together trying to get through this beautiful series on the successes and failures in prophecy. Now, this concept, as we all know, is quite a deep one for a lot of people. Many people have really, really strong convictions, and many people just doubt them entirely. Some people don't believe in prophecy. Well, given all the people in the world and all the variety of concepts, we're just offering a humble perspective today about what possibly, if you investigate it, could make a lot of sense. And we think that it's worth your time to look at this, to learn a little more. If you haven't joined us in our previous sessions, we welcome you to get to those regarding Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad. Now, having said that, we are moving on to prophecies concerning Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah in English means the glory of God. And Baha'u'llah, there are prophecies about this personage in the Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. With that in mind, we're going to be focusing on prophecies from the Old Testament and the New Testament about Baha'u'llah today. And we're going to talk about, again, successes and failures in prophecy. And likewise, we're going to speak to what we believe has high plausibility of being true, which we believe truthfully is true 100%. And we think that if you are to investigate with us, if you have some other discoveries of your own, you'll probably learn a lot more, having a little bit more perspective from other people. So with that in mind, take all that we're doing here as educated opinions from people who have gone and taken a look at these holy books, and also consider it as part of your own journey when you're trying to discover prophecy in the multitudinous meanings that they have for yourself. With that said, we welcome Mr. Jay Tyson, who's written the book Wise Men of the West, which you can find in Amazon. We really appreciate Jay Tyson being here with us today, being an author who cares about this subject, who's visited holy places in Israel. We are so happy to have you here with us today, Jay.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back. So today, we're going to be speaking of references from the Hebrew Bible, that is known to Christians as the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. And I think I'd like to simply start by addressing the question of what is meant by the latter days, because if you're not terribly familiar with prophecy, you may not realize that in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, there are many, many references to the latter days, the last days, latter times, sometimes is used. And sometimes I meet people who ask, why should we think that our age is somehow different or special from the last 20th, anytime during the last 20th centuries? I mean, all kinds of things have happened. There have been wars, there have been earthquakes, lots of things have happened. So what makes our time special? And I think it's important to address this. One of the things that is almost always associated with the references in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, to the latter days, is that it is a time after a long exile, the Jewish people would be allowed to return to the Holy Land. And if we have time, we'll go into some of the prophecies in the Old Testament about that. They refer to a time of exile and then a later time of return. This was so commonly understood that Jesus himself made passing reference to it in Luke 21:24. He said, in which he says, excuse me, that the people who rejected him will be exiled, will be gone from the Holy Land. And then he adds the phrase, until the days of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So there's a clear reference here that there is coming a time when the non-Jews will rule over the Holy Land. And of course, that happened. It was about 35 years after the crucifixion of Jesus when rebellion in Jerusalem led to the Romans coming in and destroying the city. And another roughly, I guess, maybe 60 years later, the Second Jewish Revolt led to the Romans coming in and banishing the Jewish people entirely from the land. So then the Gentiles took over, the Romans took over. Of course, we all know the history of the Holy Land has been ruled by various empires since that time, but only in the 1800s did the concept of a return begin to coalesce. And I've studied a interesting history of that time in a book called Hastening Redemption, Messianism, and the Resettlement of the Resettlement of Israel by Ari Morgenson. If you want to find out more about the early days, the earliest period, it's a good book to get. Because it all goes back to believe it or not, the late 1700s, the last decade of the 1700s. There was a Jewish rabbi called the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, and he had studied Jewish mystical work called the Zohar, which forecast that the uh, the fulfillment of prophecies, basically, he said the opening of the founts of wisdom above and below, this would happen in the year 5600 in the Jewish calendar. The year 5600 is 1840 in the Christian calendar. And he was writing in, I believe this was 1795. It created such a stir that Jewish people began to think about moving to the Holy Land. And actually it began first in 1808, so about a decade after. And more and more people from various communities around the world decided to move to the Holy Land in anticipation of the coming of the Messiah. Their date was 1840, not quite the same as 1844, but I think one could argue that the Baha'i history is a little bit unclear, but it was right around 1840 that the Bab first received revelations. He became cognizant of the fact that he was the one who had been foretold. And of course, it was 4 years later that the actual declaration occurred. So this prophecy was fulfilled, Baha'is believe, in an unexpected way. Another thing that happened in 1840, the Ottoman Empire was trying to emulate the Western empires. And one of the things they started to do was to create rights for people. In the mid 1830s, they proclaimed something called Tanzimat, which was a policy that all people, regardless of their religion or their background, they were members of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore they were entitled to the rights of citizenship. This didn't affect the Jewish people directly, or the Jewish people in the Holy Land, because at the time, Palestine was controlled by Egypt. But in 1840, the Ottoman Empire expanded itself and pushed the Egyptians out and took over the Holy Land. By extension, the Jewish people now, for the first time, had the right to purchase property in the Holy Land. And although this might not seem terribly significant at the time, it was actually, in retrospect, very significant, because it meant that the Jewish communities that had migrated to the Holy Land, they were entirely dependent on contributions from their home communities for their support because they could not own land and they could not run businesses in the Holy Land. So they were, definitely dependent on the generosity of their home communities. But once the Ottoman Empire made it clear that everyone, including the Jews, had the right to buy land and establish their own businesses, then all of that changed. And suddenly, Jewish communities in the Holy Land could support themselves. And that really opened the door to a lot more immigration of Jewish people to the Holy Land. So this was the beginning of the uh, days of the Gentiles being fulfilled, the beginning of the end, you could say, of the Gentile control of the Holy Land. Of course, it took time. It was, expanded in the later 1800s with the Zionist movement, and most people have heard of Herzog and the Zionist movement to um, expand the Jewish population in the Holy Land with the hope of a return. Of course, it became even greater after World War II when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and was no longer a significant military presence in the Holy Land. Baha'is are probably familiar with the story about how the British came in and were able to take over Haifa and Akka, and Abdul Baha was safe, even though his life was threatened at the time. And of course, the British held on to the Holy Land for the period between World War I and World War II, but they were in the process actually of um, giving independence to many of their colonies, and especially a troubling one like the Holy Land. So at the end of World War II, in 1848, the modern state of Israel was created, fulfilling prophecies in the Bible, in the Old Testament. It goes back actually to the time of Moses. Some people said, well, these prophecies were by the lesser prophets, but actually, we'll get into this a little bit. If you look way back, some of these prophecies actually go back to the first 5 books, particularly to Deuteronomy. So way back then, they were talking about how there would be a time of exile and then a time of return. Also, if you want some Baha'i commentary on this, you might want to look in the book Some Answered Questions. At the end of the 12th chapter of that book, Abdul Baha comments on how the Jewish people are returning to the Holy Land, how this had been predicted, and how all Palestine, he says, will one day belong to them. So among Christians, it is very significant to recognize that this prophecy has been fulfilled. In fact, I would venture to say that the single major factor that animates the portion of Christianity that is concerned with prophecy and is concerned with its fulfillment in recent times will cite the return of the Jews to the Holy Land as being the major reason for the excitement, the major motivating factor. Of course, it was not particularly clear to the Christian community in the 1800s that this development was definitely going to go forward. But as the time came through World War I and then, of course, World War II, it became very clear that this prophecy had been fulfilled. However, it was always associated with the coming of the Messiah. And to a Christian perspective, and a Jewish perspective, that anticipated some kind of mega miracles, I call them, um, whether it's Jesus coming down from the clouds or someone with the capacity of Moses to part the seas, Um, both communities were expecting something hugely miraculous, and to outward seeming, that did not happen. So there is this question about, the strange case of the missing Messiah, or I think the missing millennium is the subtitle of William Sears' book, Thief in the Night, that all these signs have appeared that were expected, but where is the Messiah? And this was, maybe a little bit of a problem for the Christian community after 1948, because, the state of Israel had been formed. Some of them said that, well, it's supposed to happen within one generation, and a generation typically being 30 years, maybe 40 years. But 30 years came, 40 years came. Jesus did not come down from the sky. And what that means is today, there are increasing numbers of Christians of evangelical background or literalist background who are beginning to question, something is wrong. Clearly, the Messiah was supposed to have come, could have come, within the last 60 years at least, and maybe earlier. And yet, we don't see anybody coming down from the sky. So it is time to reevaluate the interpretation of some of these prophecies. And Baha'is offer a clear reevaluation. Turning now to a different reason for the expectation of the return of Christ, I want to focus for a minute on a statement that one finds in Matthew 24, verse 14. Jesus said, this gospel, oh, excuse me, by the way, Matthew 24 is probably the single chapter in the whole book of Matthew that focuses on the prophecies of Jesus. So it's a very good one to look at the whole thing. It was given on Mount Olive, the Mount of Olives, and so it's sometimes referred to as the Olivet Discourse. But a part of that, verse 14, Jesus says, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end shall come. So he's given, previous to that, the disciples have asked him, when will the end of the age occur? And he's given various descriptions, and he seems to indicate that there's a long period, that there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. And then he gives the final sign, which is the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world, the testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. And this preaching to the whole world was a motivating factor for Christian disciples to travel to carry the message of Jesus to various places of the world. And that continued through the Middle Ages, and particularly in the 1400s, when Western nations, particularly Portugal and Spain, developed ships that were capable of sailing not just along the coasts. Of course, they had ones that sailed down the coast of Africa throughout the 1400s. So they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and then sailed to India. But that's always staying close to the shore. Eventually, they developed the ships that could simply go straight out across the ocean and sail for weeks on end. And that enabled them to carry the gospel of the kingdom to the New World. We all know 1492, the New World was discovered, and there turned out to be a whole lot more of places to spread the gospel. So this verse provided the spiritual incentive for kings to finance exploration and voyages. And it was generally recognized by the early 1800s that missionaries had followed, on in ships to these new settlements all around the world, and the gospel had reached all nations. And so this prophecy was fulfilled. Now, depending on exactly how you define nations, there some say it was fulfilled in like 1816, I think it was. Others say it was fulfilled more like in the early 1840s. But one way or another, it's generally recognized that all of the nations, the gospel had been preached in all of the nations by the 1840s. And so the end of the age had come. But again, the question is, the Messiah is supposed to return. Where is he? So that's the second of two indications, the return of the Jews and the preaching of the gospel throughout the world. And then there was a third set, which I'll talk about briefly, and that is signs in the heavens. Some of you remember reading about something called a year without a summer. This was in 1816 when extremely strange atmospheric events meant that there was snow in northeastern United States and in Europe in June, I think some in July, extremely cold weather in August. Crops failed. It was actually, I think historians recognize it as the last time that Western European civilization faced the possibility of starvation, because after that, there was enough shipping between nations that if there was famine somewhere, food could be shipped. But at that time, there was not so much capacity to move large quantities of food. And some people went hungry because of this extremely strange event. Now, as it turned out, historians have looked back and found that this was related to a huge, I think the largest volcanic explosion in recorded history happened on the island of Tambora in 1815. And that led to a huge amount of sulfuric acid being injected into the atmosphere, which collected in the polar regions, and then eventually spread southward, causing this weird meteorological event of the year without a summer. So that was one of the first signs. And interestingly enough, if you look at both William Miller, he was a young man at that time. So was Joseph Smith, who was the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Again, that's interesting that there was awareness of the Latter Days, and the Mormon Church got named after the Latter-day Saints. So there's clearly a sense at that time that they were living in the latter days. But both Joseph Smith and William Miller, two of the leading figures that started religious movements in the early 1800s around the notion of the expectation of the return of Christ, both of them had significant points in their theological development that occurred in 1816 and 1817 as a result of the extremely strange weather conditions that affected North America and Europe and are recorded in other places around the world. Um, so that's one of the signs in the heavens. There were others. One is the starfall of 1833, when a huge meteor shower, again affecting mostly North America and Europe, caused extreme consternation. A lot of people thought that the end had come. And then even closer in, the Great Comet of 1843. At this time, most people had heard of William Miller, at least in North America, most people had heard of William Miller and had heard of his predictions that Christ would return sometime in the year 1843 to 1844, depending on how you count the year zero. So when this huge comet, and this was the largest comet in recorded history up until that point, It was so bright that you could see it in the daytime. Its tail stretched a quarter of the way across the sky. So it was a huge thing. It caused a lot of consternation and a lot of people saying that, there are references to signs in the heavens that will appear, and people took this as one of the signs in the heavens. So there was a huge expectation in the 1840s that Christ would return. So, in both the Jewish religion and the Christian religion, they had a time of what was called the Great Disappointment, at least among the Christians. The fact that Christ did not return in 1844 was referred to as the Great Disappointment. If you go into Wikipedia today and look up Great Disappointment, you'll find that that's a reference to the fact that thousands or hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Christians were expecting something to happen in 1844, and nothing did, at least nothing to outward seeming. The kind of expectation that they had was not occurring. It's also was interesting for me to note, as I did some research on this, that there was a professor in New York by the name of George Bush, who no direct relation to the later presidents, but he studied Oriental languages, and he did a paper, actually a small book, about whether Christ would return, or no, excuse me, about Christ's ascension, whether Christ had ascended in physical, bodily form or in spiritual form. And his conclusion was that the way the words are written, it could all be understood as reference to spiritual form. In the same sense that someone says, I see, oh, I see, we realize that they're saying, I understand, doesn't necessarily mean they're seeing something with their physical eyes, but they understand. So there are lots of language references that have been since translated into physical interpretation, but that were originally intended to be spiritual in their interpretation. So Professor Bush did not believe that Jesus was going to return in 1844. And interestingly enough, in my research, one of the things I discovered was that he had written to William Miller and warned him not to expect physical return. Yet William Miller did not heed that warning. One of the things that I wanted to then discuss was how is it that he came to this conclusion, William Miller? Because it actually is a reasoning that one finds in the Baha'i writings. And so I think I'm going to share screen here for a minute. um, Up. This is significant when we speak to the Christian community, that we understand this and why it was so clear to so many that 1844 was the year, because the argument is still as solid as it was back then. And sometimes people get a little bit lost in it, so I tried to simplify it. In my book, I created the diagram that you see on this page. And I put this page up here, so if anybody wants to take a screenshot of it, you can take it. It's all on one page here. It's important to realize that William Miller did not simply scan through the Old Testament and cherry pick the particular prophecy that fit in with his explanations. Instead, he simply started by the statement from Jesus in Matthew 24. This is where, as I mentioned, it was on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him and said, tell us, when will this be? And what will be the signs of your coming and the close of the age? So this is the chapter in which the disciples want to know when will your return be? And among other things, as I mentioned a few things before, the verse about the message of Jesus being carried to all nations, Jesus then says, when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And so Miller said, well, okay, Jesus said, let's go look at the prophecies of Daniel and let's find out what exactly he was referring to. He found two prophecies in Daniel relating to desolating sacrilege or to the abomination of that makes desolate. Both of these prophecies were given by the angel Gabriel. And one of the things that I discovered as I did my research, I was amazed to find out that the angel Gabriel is mentioned only 4 times in the entire Bible, twice in the New Testament when he appears to tell the parents of John the Baptist that John has been born or will be born, and what his role will be. And then he appears also to Mary before Mary conceives Jesus. So twice in the New Testament and twice in the Old Testament. I always thought that Angel Gabriel was a figure that was in many places in the Old Testament, but actually, no, just twice, both of them in the book of Daniel, and both of them in these two prophecies that Jesus had mentioned. One of them is in chapter 9, where the angel speaks of there being 70 weeks of years, 70 weeks. And so 70 weeks comes out to 490 days. And in the language of prophecy, a day is taken as a year. Also in chapter 9, what's critically important is that it clearly defines the start date of this prophecy. Instead of giving a year, because there were various different systems of years and many places didn't even record years, but they give an event which was the proclamation of the return of the Jewish people from Persia to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the year of this proclamation was clearly defined, is clearly understood by historians as being 457 BC. So that's critical. Whenever you're measuring something, you have to have a starting point, and you have to have a measuring tape, a measuring scale. So in this prophecy, you have the starting point of 457 BC, and you have the scale, which is 1 day equal to 1 year. And that leads us to the year AD 43, AD 33 or 34, again, depending on how you count the year zero. And this, of course, was prophesied in this particular chapter is that this is the time when the Messiah would be cut off from the land of the living. So clearly that he would be killed. And now, whereas that might have been kind of mystifying to the people of Daniel's time, to the people after the event is very clear. This prophecy was fulfilled exactly on time. And so anybody reading this prophecy knows that Daniel had the starting year correct and he had the scale correct. It's just very clear. He nailed it, we would say today. What William Miller did was he said, well, okay, in chapter 8, we have this other prophecy. And even though it doesn't refer to the exact starting time, it seems reasonable to assume that the same starting time in chapter 9 could also be used in chapter 8. Now, in chapter 8, it talks about 2,300 days, which again, using the same scale, is 2,300 years. So, starting in 457 BC, the same date as the one for chapter 9, let's go forward 2,300 years. And that brings us to the period of 1843 or 1844. Again, depending on how you count the year zero, we in the modern world tend to think of it as there being a year zero, but actually, if you think about Roman numerals, there was no zero in Roman numerals. They had no concept of zero. And so it's reasonable to conclude that the calendar went from 1 BC to 1 AD without stopping in between. So, it just makes perfect sense that using the same start date and the same measuring tape, you should conclude that Christ would return in 1844. That was um, that was the time that William Miller expected Christ to return based on the book of Daniel and based specifically on Jesus's instructions to look at the book of Daniel. So it's fairly clear. Miller did not simply choose a particular prophecy at random out of the Old Testament. Instead, he followed the instructions of Jesus, and that's what led him to this conclusion. Now, Baha'is would find additional details in Abdul Baha's explanation, which can be found in the book Some Answered Questions, chapter 10, paragraphs 10 through 17. He uses essentially the same argument, the same explanation as William Miller, and arrived at the same date. So I'll leave that up if anybody wants to snap that for reference. Let me take a little bit of time to go into some of the specific prophecies that come from the Old Testament and from the Bible in general, because some of them are just very fascinating. Yeah, so let's if we kind of wind back in the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy, which is the fifth book of the Pentateuch, the fifth book that was attributed to the writings of Moses. I'm going to read a few verses here from Deuteronomy 4, starting in chapter 20, in verse 25. When thou shalt beget children and children's children, and ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and made a graven image, or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord thy God, to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that you shall utterly perish from off the land wherein ye go over Jordan to possess it. And you shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall be utterly destroyed. So this is Moses. They're talking, I think they're in the land of Moab, east of the Dead Sea, and they're about to cross over and go into the Holy Land. You might recall that Moses passed away before they could actually pass into the Holy Land. But Moses is here giving a warning. Not in the immediate future, beyond his children's children, remain a long time in the land, but some people are going to become corrupted. And if the corruption spreads to provoke God to anger, then you shall utterly perish off the land whereunto you go. And then it says, the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and ye shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you. And there ye shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear, nor eat nor smell. So reference to the decay, I guess you could say, of the belief among the Jews, and being forced then to worship graven images, works of men's hands, wood and stone. And then he says, but if from thence you shall seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him. And if thou shalt seek him with all thine heart and all thy soul, when thou art in tribulation, and all these things come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shalt be obedient unto his voice, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God, he will not forsake thee, will neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he swore unto them. So here's an early mention of the latter days, coming all the way from the words of Moses, referring to the latter days, and the fact that the Jewish people, if they were repentant, would return to the Holy Land after a period of isolation and separation in many different countries. Now, it's true that the Jewish people did suffer during the period of the exile in Babylon and in Persia. They were taken, but they weren't scattered to many nations at that time. They were almost all in Babylon and Persia. So that, I mean, it was a prophecy that was fulfilled in some regards. The Jewish people returned from Babylon, from Persia, to rebuild, but they were not scattered to all nations until the time after Jesus. And then also in Deuteronomy, it shall come to pass when all these things come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among the nations whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee, and shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that then the Lord God will turn thy captivity, have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out to the outermost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it. And he will do thee good and multiply thee above thy fathers. So that's from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 5. Again, a promise that the Jewish people, after being scattered to other nations, would be gathered together and would return. From Isaiah chapter 11, fascinating couple of verses. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. I think here the first time refers to the gathering of the Jewish people from Persia, but the second time is after the Jewish people had been dispersed after the Romans and after Jesus's appearance. So he shall set his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt, from Pathos and from Cush, Elam. Elam, by the way, is southwestern Persia, and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. Excuse me. He shall gather, he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. This is again Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. So another clear reference. And if you're familiar with, you have some Jewish friends perhaps, or maybe in movies you've heard the term where they sometimes say next year in Jerusalem. This is a common reference to the fact that Jewish people hoping to return to the Holy Land. That saying has been around for millennia. Also, another verse from the Old Testament, which I think is particularly clear, is the vision from Ezekiel, Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones, verses 1 through 20 or so. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he carried me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of a valley which was full of bones. And he caused me to pass by round them about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. Ezekiel was pretty clever there. So it says, again, he asked me, prophesy upon these bones and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and ye shall live, and I will lay sinew upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and breathe in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And when I behold, lo, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. And then he said unto me, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, O Son of Man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. Interestingly, when you read this, there's a footnote that says sometimes where the term breath is used, it can also be translated as spirit. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came unto them, and they lived and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. So at this point, one might think, well, this is a kind of strange vision about dry bones being raised up and turning back into a human being. But an explanation is given. It said, starting in verse 11, then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off for our parts. And this was exactly the state of Judaism at the beginning of the 1800s. Scattered communities, various ghettos around the world, dried up, seemingly powerless. How could such communities become a nation again? Just seemed totally impossible. Verse 12 goes on, therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. So this is, very interesting prophecy. It doesn't refer specifically to the end times, but in context of the other prophecies, the knowledge that the Jewish people would at some point be broken up and scattered around the world, and then they would clearly be reassembled. And this I think is, one of the main, perhaps the single biggest factor that motivates an anticipation that we live in the end times. We live in a time of fulfillment. Oh yeah, here I have the quote from Abdul Baha from Some Answered Questions. He wrote, universal peace and accord will be realized between all nations, and that incomparable branch, and in this case, incomparable branch refers to the manifestation of God, will gather together all Israel, signifying in this cycle, Israel will be gathered in the Holy Land, and that the Jewish people are scattered to the east and the west, south and north will be assembled together. Now, see, these events did not take place in the Christian cycle, for nations did not come under one standard, which is the divine branch. But in this cycle, the Lord of hosts, which is a reference to Baha'u'llah, Lord of hosts, all the nations and peoples will enter under the shadow of this flag. In the same way, Israel, scattered all over the world, what was not reassembled in the Holy Land in the Christian cycle, but in the beginning of the cycle of Baha'u'llah, this divine promise, as is clearly stated in all the books of the prophets, has begun to be manifest. You can see that from all parts of the world, tribes of Jews are coming to the Holy Land. They live in villages and lands which they make their own. And day by day, they are increasing to such an extent that all Palestine will become their home. And this was written in 1908. So this is, while the Ottoman Empire was clearly in control of the Holy Land, and yet he makes this clear explanation of what was to come.
Which chapter is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the quote from Abdul Baha is, I think we said chapter 12 in some answering questions. I have page 64, but of course that's in my edition. Yeah, I believe it's the end of chapter 12.
Not chapter 10.
Let me just
Additional details, because what you have on screen shows Abdullah's explanations and some answer question, chapter 10, paragraphs 10 through 17.
That reference, I think, was to the explanation of 1844 and the prophecies of Daniel. But the reference of the Jewish people returning to the Holy Land, that's chapter 12. All right, so let's see how we're doing for time. Yeah, I think we've used up most of the time. There are a lot of other prophecies. Well, there's a lot in the book of Jeremiah, whether it's chapter 23 or 30, chapter 48, chapter 49. Isaiah chapter 2 is particularly valuable, verses 2 through 4. You might want to look that up. Hosea 3, verse 5. Micah 4, starting on verse 1. Many other references, but it was clearly understood by the Jewish people and Christians that the time would come when the Jewish people would return to the Holy Land, and that time definitely arrived. So I guess we have a little bit of time for questions if people have any.
I guess we have, it's Tineke,
Tineke
yes. Please.
From the Netherlands. I have a question about Joel, because I think Joel 3 is really describing the whole situation we have now in Israel.
You have that in front of you. Do you want to read it?
I can look it up on my telephone. A moment. A moment. I will look it up and then I will come back. Okay? Then you can go on with other questions.
Okay. So other questions?
I'm looking right now online. I do not see questions specifically.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
see.
I have it. I found it.
Okay.
I can read it for you. For behold, that is Joel 3. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. And they have cast lots for my people and have given a boy for a harlot and sold a girl for wine that they might drink. Yeah, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. Because ye have taken my silver and my gold, and have carried into your temples my goodly pleasant things. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold into the Grecians, that ye might remove them far from their border. Behold, I will raise them out of the place whither ye have sold them, and will return your recompense upon your own head. And I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah, and they shall sell them to the Sabaeans, a people far off, for the Lord has spoken it. And then it goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting because all in the end there is Egypt. Well, it ends very good because it's about, I think, Baha'u'llah in their midst, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness, for the violence against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But
Mm-hmm.
Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will cleanse their blood that I have not cleansed. For the Lord dwelleth in Zion.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
I
that
think it's
also,
very remarkable.
yeah. Yeah, it seems very clear. Um, this whole theme of the Jewish people returning to the Holy Land is found in so many of the books of the prophets. It's just, it's kind of like background information. Anybody who's familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, will understand things in that context. And like I say, even among the Christians in the early 1800s in America, when you talk about the Latter Day Saints, the Mormon movement, people knew that they were talking about an expectation that Christ would return. Even it's interesting. A few years after the 1840s in the United States, of course, we had the Civil War and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a song that was written based on a dream that the writer had, has all kinds of references to the end of days. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Okay, so that sounds exactly like Baha'u'llah. Trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. That's a reference to the book of Revelation. It talks about the grapes of wrath. The coming of his terrible swift sword, also from the book of Revelation. His truth is marching on. So and in the various other verses, many, many references to the Bible, a clear feeling that we have come to the end times, and that there would be disasters of this nature. So, an awareness that people had that times were indeed changing, that we had reached the end of the age. This is another interesting topic. There are a few references in the book of Matthew to the end of the world, and yet when you look it up in its original Greek, the reference was to the end of the age. So most of the more modern translations of the book of Matthew speak not about the end of the world, the physical world, but the end of the age. And clearly, almost everybody will recognize that we live in a different age than the age of the 1800s, the early 1800s. that was before electricity was known about and put to good use. So clearly, we live in a new age, and it's because of this, really, that we need a new revelation. Indeed, Jesus' reference to carrying the gospel to the entire world is in some ways a way of saying, okay, when you are able to reach out all across the world, you're going to find that there are many different belief systems. And the only way that you're really going to be able to understand them, how it all fits together, is if we have a new messenger, or if Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus, certainly returns to help explain how all these different beliefs do come from one source and can be fit together.
So, Sandra, you were next, and then Terry, you can ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. I'm trying to wrap my head around the prophecies. Why were the Jews represented as dead bones? Is there some significance in terms of the Baha'i faith, in that the Baha'i faith would reanimate the Jewish nation, or the fact that we refer to Israel as our holy land? I'm referring here to Ezekiel's vision. I don't know
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And I think in some sense, when it talks about how God will breathe life into them, or breathe the breath into them as the final step, one might understand that there is still a spiritual step forward that needs to take place. So we're not perhaps at the entire end of the story in that sense, but time will tell. Just have to see. Even Baha'u'llah recognized that the Holy Land was a special place. He also recognized that there was a lot of religious animosity in the Holy Land. And as a result of that, he asked the Baha'is not to teach the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land. So it seemed like there's kind of a special, something special. We don't know exactly what will happen, but it takes a special place. And part of that is just the fact that sometimes the center is different from the outer parts, in the same way that like Washington, D.C. is not a state. It has to be different because it's the capital. So there's still more to come, more to be fulfilled. But we live in these interesting times to watch as things develop.
Hey, Terry.
All right. There's a lot of discussion. Okay, the 2,300 years. prophecy, and then you mentioned the 457 BC when the Jews were allowed to leave Persia to the Holy Land. You take that and you subtract that from 2300 and you get 1863, which is basically when Baha'u'llah declared his mission in Baghdad. Any comment on that?
I think actually, if you do the math, it brings you to 1843. As I said, because of the fact that the calendar is different from a time of from a number line. A number line, when you go from the minus section to the plus section, you have a zero in between. And it was because that does not happen in the calendar system that the actual 2,300 years forward from 457 BC brings you to 1844 instead of 1843. There are other prophecies, and we'll get into that in some sense next week when we talk about the year 1260 and the prophecies in Daniel about 1290 and 1335. The 1290 does refer to the coming of Baha'u'llah in 1863.
So that will actually be in 2 weeks, not next.
Yeah, sorry,
Next
2
week
weeks from
you'll
now.
be off.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we'll come back in 2 weeks and we'll conclude with that. We do have two questions in the chat that I want to get to first, and then we can do the remaining two hands. D asks, is there any reference to the Jewish and Palestine people living together in peace in the Holy Land? And then the second question she asks is, what is the Jewish Kohar that you mentioned earlier in the talk? Could you?
Okay, to take this second question first, I referred to the Zohar. That's Zohar, and that's a book of Jewish mysticism. And one of its central prophecies is about the year 5600, the 600th of the sixth millennium, I guess it is, in which the founts of wisdom above and of the gates of wisdom below will be opened up. So it is, a symbolic reference to the fact that both spiritually and physically, something beneficial is going to happen to the Jewish people. And that was focused on the Jewish year 5600, started in September of 1839 and concluded in September of 1840. So we know that the Bab declared in 1844. However, the Bab was clearly aware of his special role. If you look in the Dawnbreakers, you'll see in the early chapters of the Dawnbreakers the story of this youth who turned out to be the Bab, who appeared at Syed Kazim's classes, and that happened in early 1841. If you follow the footnotes, it says that the time that he left to go visit was in April of 1841. So clearly at that point, he had received some revelation, and it is very possible that that earliest revelation came in 1840 or 1839. So let's see, that was the one question. The other question about reference to the Jewish and Palestinian people living together. Yes, there's a general reference to how the wolf and the sheep will lie down together, or the lion and the I don't know, they're both ravenous animals and peaceful animals will be working together, kind of symbolic expression for the fact that many different peoples can live together in harmony. So that's kind of a general expectation that they would be some way that these people of different backgrounds could live together in peace.
So
Oh, Jennifer writes, actually, my question
Yeah.
is simple. Does it say in the Bible when Christ will return or when Jesus will return? Um, yes, well, like I said, the explanation that Jesus gave, when the disciples came to Jesus in Matthew 24 and said, when will this be? And Jesus could have said, it will happen in 1810 years from now. But if he had said that, I'm sure people would have been disappointed because the time would be so vast, so distant, and people might tend to think, oh well, I can do all kinds of things because there won't be any return for such a long time. So Christ was wiser than that. He did not give anything as clear as an exact date in that sense. He gave a reference to these prophecies in the book of Daniel and allow people to sit down and figure it out. Now, the fact that people, well, there were some people before William Miller who had come up with a similar conclusion, and there was an expectation that Christ would return. But, if you're working in the 1600s or the 1700s and you say something big is going to happen in 1844, people don't get terribly excited because it's obviously not going to affect them in their lifetime. So William Miller was picking up on this because he had the good fortune of being born in, I guess, I don't know what, the early 1800s or late 1700s, and was coming of age right at the time that the prophecy was about to be fulfilled. um, there,
Jennifer,
I think about a couple of other questions.
yeah, a few more. I guess Jennifer you have a quick follow-up to the question you just asked? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, the reason is because the other day I love Father Richard Rohr, who's written an interesting book, and he was making the distinction between Jesus and Christ. It's not Jesus Christ. He said Christ is not Jesus's last name. It's Jesus
Exactly.
Christ. And there's a difference. And he was saying Jesus is the heart, Christ is the spirit, is the universal, whatever he said. And so I have so many people that say to me, well, the second coming of Christ, Jesus is the way, the only way, and blah, blah, blah. But Jesus is the body. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to articulate to people that it wasn't Jesus, the body, it was the Christ spirit in the, whatever. I'm not very articulate when it comes to this, but I find it extremely fascinating. And so I wanted to know if in the Bible it says Jesus is returning or Christ is returning. Is there some clarity on that? Does that make sense, Jay?
Oh yeah, definitely does. And when I talk to my Christian friends, I try to emphasize that we are looking for the return of the Christ Spirit, not the return of the body of Jesus. And so, yes, it's definitely the Christ Spirit that will return. There are several references that Jesus makes to the fact that he is in heaven even while he's speaking to the people on earth. Baha'u'llah says, I have come down from heaven in the same way that Christ came down from heaven. So, of course, when Jesus told people that he had come down from heaven, they said, no, you were born from Mary. You're the son of Mary. But clearly, he was speaking of his spirit, not his body. And because people get this mixed up, because people tend to want to see things in literal terms, because we live in a materialistic age when people tend to think that the person is a body rather than being a spirit, this confusion comes up. But yes, it is often much easier to say the Christ Spirit. And, his reference to, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. I say, yes, Baha'is believe that. But we believe that the me, in this case, is the Christ Spirit, the spirit of the terminology Baha'is use is manifestation. The messenger of God is a being that is far above human comprehension. And the only way that we can know about God is through the things that have been taught to us by the Christ Spirit. Now, the Christ Spirit existed before Jesus. In fact, in that very same book, in the book of John, um, when he says, "No man comes to the Father but by me," he also says, "Before Abraham was, I am." So clearly, he was not talking about his body, he was talking about his spirit. Because if Jesus is the only way, and that means that no one prior to Jesus, none of the prophets of the Old Testament, not Moses nor Abraham, could have come to the Father. And that's just crazy. Certainly people came to the Father. How did people come to the Father before Jesus? Well, they came through Moses. And how did they come to the Father before Moses? They came through a knowledge of Abraham. And before that, the knowledge of Noah. So we come to the Father through the messenger of God, the Spirit of Christ, which existed in Moses, that existed in Abraham and Noah, and more recently in Muhammad, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster. These are beings that are as far above man as man is above the animal. And the only way that we can get to God is through the knowledge that these beings provide us. So they are, whether you speak of them as one spirit or multiple spirits, they are the only way that we can reach God, that we can reach salvation. So we agree with Jesus' statement about being the way, the truth, and the life. And the only way to get to the Father is through the manifestation, through the Christ Spirit. I hope that answers your question.
So I guess, Tinica, you have another question, and then that will be the last question, and we'll wrap up for the day. Thank you.
Well, yes, maybe it is not so much a question, but it is more about the Jewish people and what is their role in the great plan of God. And that was a question that was many years ago asked by on the Dutch summer or winter school, I don't remember exactly what it was, with Mr. Vesey. And Mr. Vesey said that the chosen people, that they were chosen to protect the great center of the last, the central faith in this whole cycle of prophets and prophecy and spiritual education of mankind in the Holy Land. So from the very beginning, it seems and it appears, I think, that God has made his plan, and he knows the psychology of his mankind, that there would be fierce enemies against the Baha'i faith, against Baha'u'llah, and that it needed protection. So it is very interesting, this time and this situation where we live in, I think. And Palestinians, well, I dived also deep into that. And I found it also very interesting that the son of Hamas, Mossab Youssef Hassan, I think, I don't know exactly what his name, but he also find out, and if you only understand the name Palestinian and how it is related to the Philistines in the times of Moses and David, King David and Saul, then nobody would like to identify with that fierce enemy of the people of God. So I think if they realize that, they are not so disappointed anymore that they must share the Holy Land with the people of Israel. They can be happy. They can be living together. So I think the whole name of Palestine will disappear in the future. Not the people and not their rights to be human beings and living together in a dignified way. But the name, I think it will be part of history, but it won't survive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about the story in the time of 1848 when many of the people, the Palestinians of northern Israel, especially around the Haifa area, were very concerned about the fact that the country was now going to be under Jewish control. And some of them were being encouraged by their political leaders to flee and come back and fight against the new country of Israel. And others were thinking, no, maybe we should stay here. And a lot of the Israelis were saying, no, you should stay here and work with us. And so some of these Palestinians in the Haifa area came to Shoghi Effendi, and they asked Shoghi Effendi, "Are you going to flee? I mean, a lot of people are fleeing, and you're of Muslim background. Maybe you should flee too." And of course, Shoghi Effendi said, "No, we're not going to flee. How can we flee? This is our holy land. This is all of our holy places. We will stay here." And as a result of that, there were a fair number of Palestinians who chose to remain, and they became Israeli citizens. And they're in Haifa. Some of the local employees are of that background. They're wonderful people. They do wonderful work for the Baha'i World Center. Um, they're a lot of people of Palestinian background, Israeli citizens of Palestinian background, who are joyfully working on the construction of the shrine of Abdul Baha right now. And many of them that have roots that go back to a few generations back to their grandparents who lived in Akka at the time that Abdul Baha lived in Akka, and they're happy to see that Abdul Baha is coming back to Akka. So there is certainly room for people, even though they're of different backgrounds, to come together and work together. And it's just unfortunate that there are some extremists in both camps that seem to want to fight instead of finding ways to live together.
Jay, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion and to, just present these ideas and help clarify a lot of subjects and themes that often go unnoticed. And if they go unnoticed, they're often misunderstood. So thank you so much. And so just for clarification, it will be in 2 weeks. Yeah. Jay Tyson will come back and pretty much summarize everything we've discussed over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, we'll be picking up on also some of the prophecies, not as many, but at least some from Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Islam.
Fantastic. So if anyone has any more questions, they can email us or they can go back and leave comments on the videos and we'll get to them.
Jeremiah, I have a quick question.
Don't forget to subscribe. They need to subscribe, Jeremiah. I'm going to ask for subscriptions.
Okay.
Subscriptions, saving the playlists.
Okay. Go ahead, Dee, real quick.
What are we having next week?
I do not know what we're having next week, but I'm sure we'll have someone. But you'll have to check.
It'll be something special. Together, okay. The audience is something. The speaker is special. Together, we make something special. So we'll have something special next week.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it. The community really appreciates it. And like John said, be sure to like and subscribe so that others
You're
can
wonderful.
Actually see videos.
Really.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.